Welcome. Today we are going to ask the question, is there anything to ethics? Is there a standard that we should look to and appeal to and say that this is what makes something right or wrong? Or is that just herd instinct, as Nietzsche was already talking about? Is the standard just ourselves, where we're going to talk about egoism? Or is it about acquiring virtues, as we already addressed earlier with Aristotle, and we'll also touch on the same notion in the East found within Confucius. Now, it's really important to note that there are three ways that people are going to approach the issue of what is ethical or not when we're talking about normative ethics and ethical theories. There's consequentialism that is going to look at the consequences of our actions and decisions. Egoism, which we're going to talk about later, is just one of these forms of consequentialism. We have deontology, usually we're going to connect this with people like Kant, and the idea is it's emphasizing our duties or rules that we have to follow and the imperatives that are set up with that, and we'll end up talking about that at another date. And then there's virtue ethics, which really emphasizes that the point of ethics is to help you become a virtuous person, developing moral character. And of course, they've got different rules and techniques and methods on how that's going to go. People like Aristotle are usually the prime discusser of virtue ethics, while Kant would be that of deontology. And consequentialism, depending on the type, we have egoism, we have utilitarianism, hedonism as well, and a few others all have their different champions on who they would end up saying which consequences we're paying attention to, whom and why. But earlier we touched on Nietzsche and his notion of where morality comes from, that it's this herd instinct, something that every philosopher since the time of Plato has tried to find a justification for. Why is it that we want to do one thing or another? And ultimately for Nietzsche, the real source of all morality was not love of neighbor or notions of virtue, as we talked about with Aristotle, but his fear of our neighbor. And therefore, Nietzsche wants to call for us to rise up above everybody else, to become these overmen who will dominate the mass herd that most morality is. Now, again, Nietzsche didn't expect for most people to do this. He just thinks that this is the only reasonable course for reasonable people who don't find any source of morality that exists anywhere else, that there's no authority for it. There's no authority in the group. The group is just a dumb herd animal. There's no authority for God, for Nietzsche. There's no authority in tradition or a lasting civilization, because that too is all just things that vanish and go away. Therefore, what we need is this will to power and overcome the morality of others, because we don't need it. And that if you do that, you become one of these great men of history. You become a pioneer in whatever industry you happen to be in, because morality is all for other people. Many of these ideas we already kind of touched on a little bit within notions of cynicism and rejection of all moral systems. Most of us probably can't do the idea of what Nietzsche wants because we have too much compassion for our neighbor. But yet, he says we need to turn that off if indeed you want to be of any consequence. But again, he doesn't hold that most of us are going to be of any consequence. Essential to Nietzsche and his notion of morality is that there is no concrete standard of morality. That's just the standard of the herd, which wants to be kept safe. But rather, Nietzsche very pointedly and explicitly states that I am morality itself, and nothing outside of me is moral. For Nietzsche, it's not that there's a standard that you're weighing your ideas against, but rather you are that standard. If you decide you want to do it, then do it. If not, then don't. It doesn't matter what anyone else says. That reason doesn't give you any answers. And therefore, it is entirely upon you to make that decision of who you are and to advance along those lines. What Nietzsche ends up embodying is this notion that morality is relativistic. Uh, he has it as an individual who decides what is moral and what is not. There's also those who advocate that the idea of what is moral is relative, but is defined by cultures instead of individuals. Cultural relativism is, again, similar, where something might be right or not, uh, but it's something imposed by a larger group of people. For Nietzsche, he's arguing against the morality of Europe. Cultural relativists would say that Nietzsche is wrong because Europe gets to decide what is moral or not. Similar things with notions of America and others. Most famous sort of example of cultural relativist, one of the great arguers for it, is William Graham Sumner, who wrote in 1906, and he said, "The right way in which the ancestors used, and which has been handed down, the tradition is of its own warrant. It is not held subject to verification by experience. The notion of right is in the folkways. It is not outside of them, or of independent origin, and brought to test them. In the folkways, whatever is right. This is because they are traditional, and therefore contain in themselves the authority of the ancestral ghosts. When we come to the folkways, we are at the end of our analysis." Sumner here is really arguing that what is moral is decided by a culture. Whatever cultural norms we have decides what is moral. Therefore, if we say that we should kill off one group of people, if that's what our culture says, that's fine. If we had a culture that everyone who's over 40 had to go ride the carousel, as in the movie Logan's Run, and essentially be executed, euthanized at the age of 40 to benefit everybody else, this is what our culture advocates. This is what is moral, according to Sumner. Now, another culture might not have that practice, as we don't, and therefore, if that practice was to happen here, we would say that's immoral. And this is the sort of argument of cultural relativists. Now, there are some major limitations to cultural relativism that we should keep in mind. Cultural relativism will tell us that it's impossible for cultures to grow or to change, because anyone who wants to do that is immoral up until the moment in which the rest of the culture has changed. Therefore, slavery is moral until the moment in which the majority of the culture says it's immoral. You can't advocate for it. You are immoral and you're advocating against it while it's still happening if the majority of people agree with that. That's a real difficult part of adopting notions of cultural relativism. And yet many people do hold this idea as well. Others, like C.S. Lewis, end up advocating that there are universal standards, that issues like slavery could always be viewed as wrong, and therefore you're not on the right side or wrong side of a momentary debate, but something is objectively just wrong. Racism is objectively wrong, regardless of the time or the culture or anything else along those lines. That there are absolute standards by which we judge morality. Now, what Lewis even argues for in one of his works is that while we have different cultural interpretations of events, the underground idea of what is moral is still there, that there are universal standards to which we will apply to specific situations. And this is really kind of the root of the discussions of when we're moving on for larger ideas of what is moral or is not, is that there is some sort of standard. The rejection of this, as people like Nietzsche would do, is kind of the problem. Again, you might accept this as the way you want to look at morality overall. But for most, there is this idea that there is a standard. Now, how to interpret that standard, which standard should be used, what's the right basis, etc., that becomes part of the discussion, instead of rejecting the notion of standards at all. Right, so we find ourselves with moral relativism, cultural relativism, and notions of universalism, all addressing and navigating the idea of what standards are going to be at the basis of morality. One of the first and easiest ones to look at is the consequentialist standards, right? What are the consequences? Are the consequences of an event good or bad? And how does that flow? And one of the easiest ways to look at that first is the notions of egoism. Is this about me? And what my consequences are. Later on, we can have discussions about how many people and how broad this should be in notions of utilitarianism. But the first and easiest way to approach this is kind of building off of what we've addressed already with Nietzsche, that I am morality, that we're going to look first at the consequences, a consequentialist view, from looking at yourself out, known as ethical egoism. Really kind of the one that is easiest to look at first, the consequence that we want to address, is notions of egoism. Uh, Egoism is really simple in many ways. You're going to do what you want to do because you want to do it. Right? It's not about the most people. It's not about anything else other than whether or not the consequences are going to be ones that benefit you. This fits in really well with some of the other discussions we've had, and is really kind of easy to see. We end up having people like Nietzsche, who ends up arguing that he's the Übermensch, the overman, and that he's morality and morality itself. There is no morality outside of him. And really, egoism follows on this idea that you need to be about yourself primarily. Now, there's different types of egoists as well. We're going to have notions of psychological egoism as opposed to ethical egoism. Psychological egoism is the view that human beings always enact from a simple way of self-love, that you are, by your very nature, if you want to be or not, an egoist. You're selfish. You care primarily about yourself. Probably an easy example comes from a champion of the notion of psychological egoism, Adam Smith. Now, again, most of you know Adam Smith probably from his discussion of economics. His work, The Wealth of the Nations, is very important for anyone in the economic sphere. But he touched on the issues of morality in his work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in this work, he says that suppose that the great empire of China, with all of its myriads of inhabitants, was suddenly swallowed up by an earthquake. Now, how many, people who have no connection to that part of the world, how would they react upon hearing this news? How would you react if, assuming you don't have any sort of connection to anyone in China or anyone who's over there visiting or anything else along those lines, and you hear that the entire country just got swallowed up in a giant earthquake? Likely, you'd say you feel sad that there is some sort of loss in the sake of all of humanity, that, the millions of people who died, or billions of people today who've died. It's a catastrophic loss to have an entire nation disappear. And of course, you might donate some money to some relief causes, and you might apply some of this, but really, it's not going to affect you much more than the idea that you're going to feel sad briefly. And then kind of move on with the rest of your day, because largely it doesn't affect you. Now, he's going to say if we compare that to what he calls a frivolous disaster which can befall you, if you were to lose your little finger tomorrow, if I was to inform you that tomorrow you are going to end up losing your little finger, well, most of you, this is a fairly inconsequential loss. I mean, it's a finger, but most of you are not, expert, concert pianists or violinists or anyone else who constantly are using your little finger. So to lose this is just going to be really kind of inconvenient. It's going to be a story you're going to have to tell. It's going to, cost you something. But it's not the end of your life. It's not you can never be the same. You're not a hand model who's losing your career. So this is really, in the grand scheme of things, a fairly small loss. And Adam Smith points out that if you knew this, if it was informed on you that this was going to be the case, that there was no way for you to escape it, you wouldn't sleep tonight. You'd be fretting and fighting and wrestling with yourself. It would take you a long time to get to the point of acceptance that this loss of your little finger is going to happen. And again, it's a loss. It's not huge, but it's a loss. And Adam Smith wants to point out that, right, you're going to have this great disparity between losing of a finger, which most of you aren't using that much anyways, compared to the loss of millions of lives in a foreign land. And this just points out that indeed you are selfish, that your concerns are about you first and foremost. All right, there's a lot of things that can happen all over the world, and you can hear about a lot of horrible stories that happen to other people. And you would admit, most of you, that other people have it far worse than you do. But yet that doesn't take away your problems, right? The pebble in your shoe is important because it's in your shoe. It might just be a pebble, but it's affecting you, right? It might not be the end of the world, but it affects you. And this is the argument from the psychological egoist, that you always act from this idea of self-love, from self-interest, that your primary concern is not in the welfare of humanity. Your primary concern is not in wanting the world to be a better place. Your primary concern is about you and what is going to help and affect you. You might disagree with that, but this is the claim of psychological egoism. Now, psychological egoism is a little bit different from the idea that saying you ought to be selfish, right? Saying that you are selfish and that we have this as a trait is something that many of us might want to overcome and fight against. But there are other people who make the argument that indeed we are selfish. Plato, in his work, The Ring of Gyges, ends up giving this sort of fantastical story of a farmer who, after an earthquake, maybe it's a recurring one, who knows, goes into this giant sort of gorge, and he ends up seeing all of these beautiful statues and gold and whatever, and he ends up picking out a ring, and then coming back up to talk to some of his friends. And while he's talking with some of his friends about to tell him about this great fortune he sees, he's playing with the ring, and he's kind of spinning the ring around it, and he notices that when the stone is on the outside, his friends are all seeing him and talking to him, but when he turned it facing in, his friends all don't notice him anymore, that he's gone, and he soon discovers that he's invisible, and of course, what does this end up doing? You end up having this sort of advanced sort of cause and discussion along these lines. Plato ends up asking, of course, what are you going to do if you find out that indeed you can become invisible? The story of the Ring of Gyges is the man ends up going off and killing the king, seducing the princess, ends up taking everything he wants. But the question really is, who, according to Plato here, wouldn't just go into the market if they could be invisible and take anything they want? In front of our friends, of course, we would say, no, we don't want to do that. That, of course, that would be an immoral act. But Plato ends up saying that if you're truly invisible, and for the theists, right, let's extend the argument to invisible even to the eyes of God, right, that there's no sort of negative repercussions that can happen. Who doesn't just take what he wants? Plato ends up calling this man a wretched fool, a wretched idiot. That while your friends might praise you to your face, even behind your back, they're saying, no, this is not right. This is not the good idea. That this is not going to be what's going to benefit you. And that this becomes the sort of challenge that that ethical egoism has. While psychological egoism says that you are selfish, ethical egoists argue that indeed you ought to be selfish. That this is the claim, that this is the identity. And Plato in this work, The Ring of Gyges, demonstrates this pretty well. Beyond just what Plato is saying, egoism really advocates that egoism itself is a good thing. That it's not just how we are, but it's how we ought to be. To kind of paraphrase it off of the Oliver Stone movie Wall Street, egoism is good, right? This idea of greed, of wanting more, of wanting to accumulate, wanting security, wanting safety, wanting to excel, are all good things. Now, many of us might say, it can get too much. And then the egoist would say, if it's too much, then it's not healthy for you. Right? It's not just accumulate, accumulate, accumulate. If it's going to tear you down and destroy you, then you're not being a good egoist. All right, if it's all about you, you still need to find the balance of what's going to work out well for you. This is the argument that we want. This is what we need to say. This is what egoism is advocating that we do. Indeed, there's a famous story about kind of the good ways of being selfish about Abraham Lincoln. It says that the great emancipator was once on a train with somebody else advocating that we are all selfish. And while he's going across the train, he ends up hearing of some piglets who are stuck in the muck and are going to die, and the mother sow is squealing while her piglets are stuck. And Abraham Lincoln immediately, stops the train, and he gets out and he helps the piglets out, and then he gets back on the train and talks with his friend. And the guy saying, "Well, look at this! You just did an unselfish act. You just helped the piglets out." And Abraham Lincoln says, "No, this was the height of selfishness. I wouldn't have been able to sleep tonight if I didn't take care of this." Right? That he was still doing this act, even though it's a good act, even though it's an act for somebody else, out of this idea of still being selfish, that he's still looking out for him and for his wants and his concerns. And so this is kind of the idea that there's sometimes a good way of being selfish. And egoists oftentimes can make this claim, right? That looking out after your own best interests is sometimes helping out others, right? It's not just that you are cut off from the rest of the world and don't care about anybody. In fact, there's even those who make the argument that egoism is beyond simply looking out after yourself, but that egoism is the idea that we should all hold on to. Milton Friedman, the famed economist, ends up having this famous discussion about the pencil. And while he's looking at the pencil, right, he's going to say that no single person could have ever made a pencil. And indeed, this is, at least in part, true. Right? All of the parts, all of the resources that are needed to make a pencil come from all over the world. The graphite comes from some mines, the wood from others, the paint is mixed in one place, the rubber is made on one side of the world while the lumber is treated in another, let alone all of the other tools that are needed to be able to cut the wood, to mine the graphite, to harvest the rubber, and all of the other steps along the way. And that even a simple little thing like a pencil that doesn't cost you very much is based on this idea that everyone is doing what is in their own best interest. The miner, it is in their interest to mine the graphite. They get paid for it. The rubber tree farmer, the same. The lumber mill, the same. Everyone along the way is doing what is in their own interest, and it benefits you, is what Milton Friedman wants to argue. Right? By everyone being selfish, we're going to put away some of our disagreements that we have with other people. Right? There's people all over the world who come into making this tiny little thing called a pencil. People of different races, different religions, different nationalities, different things of what they would say is the most important thing for them in their own life. And yet, they all have this same sort of idea that we're producing this. And that you, by entering into the economic sphere, Milton Friedman argues, are paying, a few minutes of your time for, their entire life's work over and over and over again in large issues of gratitude. And that this becomes the way the cycle works. And that only through egoism can we produce things. Only through egoism will we end up putting aside the things that separate us. And that egoism can help us out along the way. Let us briefly revisit Aristotle, who we talked about earlier in this semester. As you recall, Aristotle began with the question of what is it that we're seeking after? What is it that we want? Many of us can think of immediate wants and needs that we have. We might want for us to be here at the weekend where we can relax and spend time with friends, or even for the semester to be over where you can be on a break and enjoy not having all of the same responsibilities, or you want a good grade in a class, or some other immediate tangible need. But Aristotle continued to ask us why. That everything is done not just for itself, but for the purpose of something else, until we can't have any other answer to that why question. Right? So we followed this long chain of events of why. And he says ultimately, what everything is pointing to, what everything is really looking after, is this notion of eudaimonia, sometimes translated as happiness, though that notion of happiness is usually got a little bit lacking to it. Oftentimes, the better translation is that notion of flourishing. He says that eudaimonia, this flourishing, is what's held to be always for the sake of itself and never for the sake of something else. Therefore, even wanting a break, wanting to be with friends, wanting to relax or be engaged in something is for the sake of flourishing. Because indeed, relaxing, if it's not actually recharging you and helping you move forward, it's just sloth, and that's too much. And we've ran past the notion of the golden mean that Aristotle talks about, right? If it's not done for flourishing and making your life better, then it's not of service at all. And that's not really what you're seeking after. Because Aristotle points out that eudaimonia, this flourishing, is not momentary happiness, but how we would identify our happiness in a complete life. Did you live every day like there's value enough that you don't feel like you've wasted it all? And of course, there's a certain amount of waste here and there. And the whole point for Aristotle was to try to find ways of acquiring the virtues where your life will seem complete and be a flourishing life at that point. Of course, this all is about being virtuous for Aristotle and avoiding those vices. To help us avoid the vices that exist, we have to find that beautiful little golden mean that's there in between the extremes. We find ourselves wrapped up in notions of habit that often take us from one routine to doing it over and over and over again. And we need to make sure that the habits that we are creating are virtuous habits and not those that feed into our vices. Of course, for Aristotle, this is found through emulating those who you see as virtuous. And that by being virtuous, we'll see the benefit of that virtue, because at that point, we will truly flourish. That when our vices take over and control us, then we fail to really thrive and live, and we find ourselves in a whole host of other problems. But if we take on the habits of the virtuous people who avoid the extremes of deficiency or excess, then we're able to rise above everything else, and we will truly have a life that's one that's worth living. It's a morality that's not based upon just my individual wants, because there seems to be an actual standard to this, right? This is why the golden mean is something that can apply to pretty much everybody. It's not set up by a culture, although there's definitely cultural weight into it. And it's not just about the consequences, as consequentialists will say, nor is it about the duty that you're going to have to prescribe as deontology. Virtue ethics seek virtue for its own sake, and also for the sake of a flourishing life which cannot be lived without virtue. Aristotle is usually seen as kind of the archetype of virtue ethics. But we have a similar example also found in the East, in China, with Confucius. Confucius is a reformer of Taoism, and he ends up having a different sort of approach, but also is advocating that we need to hold the notion of virtue, that this is what's going to help you understand things. The aim of the Tao is to find a path that will afford kind of the best interactions with nature. Taoism, the Tao, literally is the way of nature. And Confucius is kind of as a pushback and a tweaking of the traditional understanding of the Tao. And so he's wanting to say that we need to have this sort of more proactive stance than just the traditional way, which is a little more passive. And again, that's an overgeneralization. But this becomes a sort of discussion. And Confucius wants us to be virtuous in this process as well. The traditional way of understanding Taoism comes from Lao Tzu and his discussion of what the nature of the Tao. Lao Tzu ends up arguing that the best way to approach life is to kind of mimic what water does. Right? It always takes the path of least resistance, and is more often than not, this means being useless to others. This is the reform that Confucius really wants to have. While Lao Tzu would advocate that we need to be useless, Confucius says that we need to be useful, and that being useful becomes the prime virtue. Again, Lao Tzu looks at this differently, and so to kind of see a comparison between this. Lao Tzu famously tells the story of what's known as a useless tree. It says that one day, the carpenter and his apprentice were out looking for wood to build whatever it is that they're building. And they're out looking at different trees, and at one point, the apprentice kind of looks at this gnarly, ugly tree, and he just kind of says, "What a useless tree," and continues on walking, and later on that night he goes to sleep, and while asleep he has a dream, or he encounters this ugly, gnarled, useless tree. And of course, the tree talks because it's a dream, and that's the way things are. But the tree ends up asking this carpenter's apprentice, "Why is it you call me useless with such disdain?" And the apprentice says, "Well, you're ugly and you're gnarled and you're not really kind of fit for anything." And the tree kind of advocates for itself and saying, "It is to my benefit that I'm of no use. It's of no benefit that my branches are not heavy and strong, that birds are going to land and fall and make their homes in me and therefore tire and weary me out. It's to my benefit that I don't bear any fruit that's going to be plucked and destroyed and that my limbs are going to be ravaged. It's to my benefit that I'm not long and straight. Otherwise, you would have chopped me down for wood for whatever craft you are doing. Indeed, it is to my benefit to be of use to nobody, because that's what's going to help me become and live a long and productive life." Productive primarily being in the idea that you're living forever or near forever. And that this idea of immortality becomes the goal. And therefore, while it might not be useful for others, the uselessness of the tree is useful for the tree. And this is the same sort of idea that a lot of people have. The discussion really kind of grows into the term pu when developing this idea of an uncarved block of wood. And for Lao Tzu, the idea is that you should be like this pu, like this uncarved block of wood that is completely useless and therefore is not getting worn down and destroyed. Confucius looks at this same uncarved block of wood and says it has the potential to become extremely useful, that something good may come out of it, that this becomes what is our starting point, but that we should be carved. Lao Tzu says, no, we shouldn't. And this becomes the debate between the two. And where virtue is found for Confucius is in finding the right sort of carving that's going to be done to you, that is going to bring about the greatest good and harmony, becomes the virtue for Confucius. Lao Tzu, again, views this notion differently. Confucius will kind of lay out many more of his ideas in the works known as the Analytics. And in the Analytics, we have a handful of sayings. The master, usually Confucius, telling something to somebody else of what is virtuous. A couple of examples of these are, the master said, those who are without virtue cannot abide long either in a condition of poverty or hardship or in a condition of enjoyment. Right? That if you don't have virtue, it doesn't matter how long you live. You're not happy with yourself if you're not virtuous, and therefore it doesn't matter if you have a lot of money or you don't have any, right? That virtue is far more important than material goods or comfort, because even if you're surrounded with opulence, you won't be comfortable with yourself, and that this becomes an important thing. Right? The master said, the superior man will think of virtue. The small man thinks of comfort. The superior man thinks of sanctions of the law, the legal codes that can be created for this. The small man thinks of favors by which he may receive. Right? That we have this sort of balancing act between the virtuous man, the superior man, and what Confucius is calling here the small man. That the significant man is going to think about what is best for everybody. What laws can be enacted that are going to help make a harmonious society, as opposed to what favors can I get. Right? We have this sort of ideal political leader in the eyes of Confucius, right? It's somebody who's truly egalitarian with their ideas, as opposed to, getting elected to get rich or to have power. That the truly virtuous man is going to use this power for good ends that is really going to make everybody's life better. That you're not just thinking about your comfort. In fact, virtue might not let you be comfortable in your external world, but you will be comfortable with yourself. And that this becomes part of the arguments that Confucius would make about what is truly virtuous and how you need to see yourself and others. Right, and so we find ourselves here at the end of this discussion with understanding that there's a difference between just consequences and virtues. And right, there's these two different sort of ethical theories or ways of approaching ethical dilemmas. The consequentialist is looking at what is the outcome of it, as opposed to what is a truly good thing to be done, and why is this thing truly good. Later on, next time, we will end up addressing issues of utilitarianism versus Kantianism or deontology, where we're going to add to consequence this notion of duty. And we can find ourselves within all of these discussions addressing what's commonly known as this trolley problem, which we'll talk about more in detail next time. But right, the trolley problem essentially goes, there's a trolley, an out of the way, trolley that's running down. And if you do nothing, the trolley is going to kill 5 people. You have the option, though, of pulling the lever, which will change the track of the trolley, and it will kill 1 person. Now, for both the deontologist and the virtue ethicist, this is a real sticky sort of position, that you don't just pull the lever, because are you being virtuous? Are you doing your duty not to kill by doing so? The consequentialists oftentimes will just look at the raw numbers and say 5 versus 1, the moral thing is to actively kill the 1 person, as opposed to passively letting 5 people die. And again, this is something for us to kind of think about and apply as time goes by. But what consequences you're going to look at and how you're going to address things like this, a fairly real world, although hyperbolic, situations, right? We have a lot of different events in our life that we can look at that fit into this sort of idea. And this is the question that we have to ask ourselves. It's also important to note that egoism is just one type of consequentialist theory. Right? Egoism looks at the consequences on how it's going to affect you. An egoist might look at that same sort of trolley problem and say, I couldn't live with myself if I killed the 1 person. That would haunt my dreams. As we saw kind of with Abraham Lincoln and the pig. Same sort of story, right? And so you're looking at the actions that affect you. Hedonism, a doctrine we've talked about quite a few times, really looks at notions of pleasure versus pain and kind of becomes the foundation for a lot of different consequentialist theories on, do we want more pleasure and less pain, and how do we orchestrate that, and how do we do that? Utilitarianism, which we'll get into more in the future, really is about what's going to have the most amount of pleasure and least amount of pain for the most people. Right? So it's not just about you like the egoist, but for the greatest number of people. There's also some theists who we would identify as consequentialists, that they're going to say that everything has this sort of eternal consequence, and therefore your actions are always done for how it's going to relate to appeasing, relating, coercing this God into letting you end up having an eternal life of reward as opposed to consequence. And so everything has this sort of intrinsic value wrapped up in making sure you obey the God, even though your momentary life might fail, might be bad, right? You might find your reward for martyrdom being in heaven with whatever benefits that are promised to you, right? You're doing your actions because of this consequence, not out of duty, but because of the good you're going to find. Some theists are going to be saying it's the duty, and I'm following that out of this moral obligation to duty instead. So again, theists are not all consequentialists, though some may be. It kind of goes down to that motivation as well. You kind of have a theistic egoist for some as well, which kind of makes life a little tricky. So you can look at these and address these as well. So a final recap, right? We've had a lot to go over in this last hour. First of all, just asking the question of where does morality come from, as Nietzsche was advocating? Are you morality in itself? Is morals entirely the realm of speculations and up to the individual to decide what it is? Or, like some are advocated, are we going to say that morality is something that is agreed upon by an individual culture? Beyond this is, right, maybe it's more like Lewis, as well as Aristotle and Confucius would advocate that there are universal morals. There is a good out there, and our objective is to find that good. And then we really spend our time today talking about one consequentialist theory against the ideas of virtue ethics, right? We talked about the idea of psychological egoism, that you just are selfish as your psychological basis. As opposed to the idea advocated by many that you ought to be selfish, right? Plato advocated for this. We even got Milton Friedman kind of talking about the benefits of this, right? So we have these sorts of discussions to hold in there as well. This is held over against Aristotle and Confucius, that the idea that there are virtues, right? We're finding either the golden mean, or we're going to make ourselves useful and become a carved block of wood that has some sort of application for that. Looking at all of this, right, you kind of need to weigh out in your own mind what is the best course of action. How should you address what is ethical or not? What's, and maybe it's a combination of things. Maybe you're going to say, I'm going to be a universalist, but I'm going to be an egoist in these ways. And so I think there's a universal standard, but it's really about me, or it's about the greatest number of people, which we'll talk about in the future, or it's just doing what these virtues are going to say. That there's different ways of approaching these larger categories of what is ethical and what's going to help you address these sorts of questions. So again, as we're concluding, think about moral questions you have, and which of these ideas is going to help you the most in addressing these situations. Do we need to advocate for individualism and egoism to be our moral standard? Is it the consequence, or is it about the actions themselves, or is it about where you're being useful? Again, consider all of these things, and have a great rest of your day.